Um, Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Bermuda Chapter of the CPCU Society, I'd like to welcome you to our subject today, Is Your Company Ready to Handle a Data Breach? So to start, I'd like to introduce our panel. First up, we have Mr. Spencer Pollock, who is the Partner and Cybersecurity Practice Lead at Niles, Barton & Wilmer. Mr. Pollock is an award-winning cybersecurity attorney, a public media figure, and leads the cybersecurity law practice at Niles, Barton & Wilmer. Mr. Pollock has extensive experience assisting clients in preparing and responding to cyber attacks and data breaches, handling regulatory investigations, and ensuring organizations comply with all applicable state, federal, and international cyber laws. Mr. Pollock is also an experienced trial and civil defense attorney, served as first chair on over 50 jury and 300 bench trials. Welcome, Spencer Pollock.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Natalie.
Okay. Next up, we have Mr. Neel Desai, who is the AVP for Cyber Technology Liability at Hiscox. Mr. Desai is responsible for cyber-related claims and litigation. He has vast experience counseling affected cyber policy holders on all stages throughout the life cycle of a privacy matter, from the discovery of a suspected breach through the investigation and breach notification process, and the conclusion of third-party claims. Mr. Desai assists internal stakeholders and product managers in drafting cyber insurance contracts and developing cyber programs, including creating vendor panels, forms, and templates. Welcome, Neel Desai.
Thank you, Natalie.
Great. So just to let everyone who's watching know, we will have time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to type in your questions throughout the discussion and we will get to them. So I'm excited to dive into this topic, so let's get right into it. So you both come from different industries. What's the relationship between the two as it relates to a breach? Neel, can we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the relationship between companies like Hiscox, who are the insurance carrier, both primary and excess for a wide array of businesses throughout the country, is that we look to firms like Spencer's at Niles Barton for that initial kind of investigation, oversight of the forensics vendors, any other vendors that we may require as a result of a data breach. And while the insurance carrier is generally the first call that we would expect our insureds and policyholders to make, once we are fairly clear as to what occurred, whether it be a ransomware event or a business email compromise type of event, we want to ensure that we have a law firm like that of Spencer's involved at the outset, so that if there are notifications required, whether it be individual or regulatory notifications, or there are possible third-party claims that we believe may arise as a result of a breach that our insured has suffered, that we have our insured placed with a law firm like that of Spencer's, so that they are properly taken care of and that they ensure that all of their responsibilities that are required by law as a result of the event that may have occurred are overseen and handled appropriately by a breach counsel type law firm. So like I said earlier, as we want to be the initial call for our policyholders, we also want to ensure they're protected from a legal standpoint. And so that as we dive into what happened, what occurred, how did the threat actors access their systems, that we're also keeping in mind what their legal obligations may be as a result of what occurred. So that's where the relationship stems from. And, as we navigate breaches and other incidents, we look to kind of each other for both oversight of the investigation, but also to ensure that our insureds are protected legally.
Great, thank you. Spencer, anything to add from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think Neel hits on the big points. To me, I look at it as very much a team-centric approach, and that's kind of going to be a message interweaved throughout this. The relationship between, say, myself and Neel needs to have great synergy, to deliver the best work product and the best results for the insured and the client. And Neel being that kind of first point of contact and coordinating, and then bringing me in and then all of us working together is a really important aspect, because obviously when I get a case, I don't do any coverage work. I do all the kind of breach response. So having someone like Neel, who's very knowledgeable about the coverage and is able to speak with the insured about it, makes my life a lot easier. I've had, situations where maybe an insurer or the adjuster I'm working with, and I'm sure adjusters and claim representatives on the other side have attorneys who are probably similar into their space or specialty, but working with adjusters and claim representatives who aren't comfortable maybe talking about coverages or comfortable diving into it. So, I mean, Neel and his team are great about that. And to have that kind of depth and knowledge, I would say the front end is very important.
Great, thank you. So from both of your perspectives, what are some considerations and steps that companies should take before a data breach occurs? Spencer, why don't we start with you?
I mean, it's a great question, and it's something I talk about with a lot of my clients. You know, my biggest goal is to get to a client before a data breach, because what I tell every client that has called me for a data breach, if that's the first time we're talking, it's usually not the happiest of conversations because a lot of things are going on, a lot of chaos, a lot of concern, understandably. But at the front end, the big things I always tell clients to consider is first, we have to think about the legal compliance aspect. So the cost of a data breach on average globally is about 3.86 million. People that have more preparation in place, have a team in place, prepare and test it, save about 1.3 million on average. Obviously, we can scale up or down. Another part of that is the legal compliance aspect. Companies that aren't legally compliant increase their breach costs by hundreds of thousands of dollars. So in terms of the front end, to get compliant, you know, understanding to get those policies, procedures, protocols in place, to understand the data you have there, and to understand maybe the obligations you have. And the second, as I touched on the start, is we got to make this a team-centric approach. I mean, this is not just a legal problem. This is not just a tech problem. This is not just a finance problem. This is not just an IT problem. It's an enterprise-wide issue. And we need to incorporate every necessary person. So whether that's internal, external legal, internal, external tech, insurance, C-suite, everybody across the board needs to be involved in this, because when a breach does happen, if you don't have these parties already engaged and involved and understand the issues, it makes life a lot worse and a lot more of a headache. You know, finally, I always, and now especially in light of the SolarWinds breach, we really need to take a closer look at our vendors and how our vendors are creating huge vulnerabilities for us. So when I say a vendor, I mean any external company that you maybe hire to work with you and that you give information to or has access to your systems. Examples, obviously an IT company, managed service providers, banks, credit card processing, security, HR, background checks. And if you think about it, our society has become very much decentralized. So rather than having everything in a back office, now we've outsourced all of those to different vendors. So we went from having maybe 1 or 2 points of vulnerability to having hundreds. And making sure that those vendors are compliant is so important because, one, under the law, you have to have it contractually obligated with a vendor to do certain specific cyber aspects. And also you need to do that vendor due diligence. So those are the 3 big things I hit on them. And I'd probably kick it to Neel at this point to get his thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those are very valid points. I mean, one of the biggest issues that we see just, you know, on insurance claims end is a lack of employee training. I think if there was more proactivity from our policyholders as far as ensuring that all of their employees had, active and ongoing cybersecurity education, there would be a lot less events of the magnitude that we see. I mean, we see so many instances where, you know, there's a large breach or large cyber event as a result of an employee just clicking a wrong link or going to a website that was obviously spoofed, and resulting in just a litany of costs that could have been avoided had there been a little bit more proactiveness by the company generally, as far as training employees, as well as just putting on education and doing tabletop exercises and other things with the staff to ensure that those minor things that, you know, can easily happen can be avoided and prevent these larger attacks. We see that a lot of times our insureds are really not clued into all of this until they actually suffer a large event. and it's almost like a light bulb goes off in their head that, oh, maybe we should have considered, multi-factor authentication, or we should have considered running some tabletop exercisers, or we should have had a emergency plan in place for this type of event, and we did not, and therefore we had a lot more damage that occurred than would have had we been a little bit more prepared. So I think there's just there are a number of companies that we insure that just have not made that a priority, and sometimes they may work out where they don't experience any events, but when they do, I think a lot of them just become very, very aware of just how much some minimal training and activity would have helped to prevent the scale of what occurred. So I think along with what Spencer said, I mean, I think there's just, it's also, I think, incumbent upon us as a carrier, as well as our industry partners, to be more proactive on our end in educating our insureds on, hey, like, you can implement, these following 3 or 4 items, and you may significantly decrease the percentage chance that you're going to be impacted by a ransomware attack or some other type of cybersecurity event. So going along with what Spencer said, which is also very important, relying on our vendors, but I think just employee education is a huge thing that just does not get enough focus with our policyholders generally.
Do you see any
Spencer, I don't know
differences? Sorry. Do you see any differences or challenges in getting those preparations set up with different types of organizations, different sizes of organizations, that sort of thing?
Yeah, Spencer, I don't know what you've seen with your clients as well, as far as the scale of training that you may or may not see when you're advising them either pre or post attack. But we definitely see a lot more stringent policies and education implementation from our larger insureds than we do our smaller ones. Not only because they do have more of a capacity to undertake it, but also because I think they've dealt with issues like this in the past, and therefore they're more keenly aware of the need for it. So it is a little bit more challenging to get our smaller insureds to embrace this type of thing, and we generally don't see it as extensively when we do handle claims that are involving our smaller insureds.
Yeah, I agree with Neil. I would say my small to mid-sized clients, it's hard to really get their heads around this in terms of all the preparation at the front end. Usually they just think that their external IT is covering everything, and if they don't have insurance, they're like, well, we really don't want to spend the money for that. Is it really likely it's going to happen to us? We're not Target, we're not Marriott. Why do we have to have these policies, procedures? Why do we have to do the vetting? And what I have to explain to them is like, look, I think 60% of small to mid-sized businesses in 2018 got hit with a cyber attack. Now, how many of that really escalated or knew it was a data breach? I'm not sure, because a lot of times you have a cyber attack, but you just don't think it's a data breach. So trying to get people to wrap their heads around, here's what you need to do at the front end to obviously save money, but also protect your clients, protect your employees, protect that information, that confidential information you have. And helping them realize that they are a target. Unfortunately, they're low-hanging fruit, and hackers don't really care. I mean, I've got a client right now that's a solo shop, not many clients, and just had a ransomware attack, and they don't understand why they wanted to target them. And what I tell them is it's easy for them, and so you have to get that preparation on that front end.
Thank you. So when a data breach does hit, which inevitably does, even though companies do have preparations in place, what are some common pitfalls and mistakes an organization tends to make? Neil, can we start with you on that one?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, the biggest thing we see is that our insureds are either they don't have a plan in place for when an attack hits, or they wait too long to contact the insurance carrier, and thereby increasing the cost that may be associated with the event. They're going to vendors that may or may not be on the insurance company's panel, which is leading to a much higher level of cost. I mean, one of the things that I try to educate all of our policyholders on is that we have a very, very, and not just Hiscox, but across the board in the insurance industry in the U.S., there are very, very refined and dedicated cybersecurity panels that we have vetted, that we have experience with, that we have negotiated lower rates with, who are ready to become involved. As soon as an event hits and we're notified whether that be on the breach counsel side with firms like Spencer's, or on the forensic side, or if there are notifications required, or public relations costs, or credit monitoring. There's literally a panel of vendors that we have and that other insurance carriers have dedicated to us and others in the industry for all of those aspects that may ultimately be required or needed as a result of a cyber event that a company may be hit with. So I can't tell you how many times I've seen an insured get hit by a ransomware event or a business email compromise and waiting a week or 2 weeks or sometimes longer to advise us because they think, oh, they have it under control. We have internal IT people here that might be able to negotiate this ransom with the threat actor without the need for our insurance carrier. And 9 times out of 10, it results in excessively higher costs. It complicates the situation because you've now involved a number of people or vendors or IT people with the event that may not have as much education as our vendors have. We work with forensics vendors who, some of them are former hackers themselves from Russia or elsewhere. They have a very innate knowledge and ability to not only negotiate with these threat actors, but communicate generally with them. So, we're now seeing that they're able to, once we resolve whether we pay a ransom or not, they're able to even extract information from these threat actors as to how they got into our insured systems, what were the vulnerabilities they saw with our insured systems that allowed them to put the level of damage that they did onto our insured servers or systems. So, that's really the number one biggest pitfall that I see is just a lack of urgency to contact the insurance carrier and involve them. A lot of times our insureds are aware they have this coverage, but they're not really educated on what exactly the coverage is or what costs may or may not be covered. And, especially now with the level of third-party claims we're seeing, whether they be class action lawsuits or individual third-party claims from our insured customers arising from a data breach, we want to ensure that, like I said before, firms like Spencer's are involved at the outset because the only way we're going to be able to mitigate those types of claims is through breach counsel involvement. So every time I have a claim now, with the amount that we oversee, it's always very, very much a priority for me to let them know that in the future, they really need to have a plan in place that their entire organization is aware of, and that the number one part of that plan should be that as soon as there's any evidence whatsoever of an attack or a data breach, there needs to be immediate contact made with the insurance company. All insurance companies have a 24/7 hotline, which can be called by our insureds at any moment and will immediately garner them a response from whether it's somebody here internally or from a breach counsel law firm or from a forensics vendor, and they can get the ball rolling immediately on a response. So I think we always see higher costs if we're not contacted immediately, and we always see more complication and inevitably more third-party claims when there is no immediate contact. And so that's something that we're trying to do a much, much more immediate job of letting our insureds know.
Yeah, and Neel is preaching my language and touching my soul with everything he just said, because to me, one of the biggest problems is, you're right, just sitting, an insured or a client just sitting on a breach and thinking, well, it's fine. I got my external MSP, my external IT, they're handling it. Not a big deal. And then they wait a week, they wait 2 weeks. Maybe they're like, oh, we got a backup, it's fine. We restored the backup, from ransomware. And then all of a sudden they have a second ransomware 2 weeks later. And then, they call Neel calls me, and I'm like, what's going on here? Why did we wait 2 weeks? So big problem is just underestimating, and that's another common theme. We underestimate the existential threat we're facing with these cyber hackers and these criminals and these state-sponsored actors. Now, we underestimate that, okay, this is going to impact our business. This is going to have downtime. This is going to have costs, from the legal, financial, reputational side. And when you don't involve your insurer, when you don't involve me in legal, you're putting almost yourself at such a disadvantage. The second problem I've just see all the time is that obviously the delay involving the insurance company and the delay involving legal for some of my clients who don't have insurance. A big thing for me is protecting everything that happens. So by that, I mean, I want everything protected under attorney-client privilege, and I want all the work done under attorney work product. So to do that, I've got to engage these vendors, these forensic vendors, PR, credit notification. They all need to be engaged by me on the company's behalf, because the second that happens, everything that they're doing is by my instruction. So it's going to be protected. So what do I mean by protected? God forbid there's a class action lawsuit, say in 6 months or a year. If I've retained these vendors, then your insured, your client, the client, can't have the information that they find come out in discovery. So on the other side of that, if the client or insured is going out and retaining these kinds of companies to do this work, the remediation and investigation, then all of that stuff, all the things they find out and they report, is probably not stuff that you want to come out in litigation. So that's a huge concern I have when I come in. The final part is, I call it loose lips, sink ships, is internal, external communication. Can't tell you how many times I've come in and all of a sudden the insured or the client has sent an email out to employees that is very detrimental. And it's almost that we neglect, once again, we underestimate the seriousness. We send an email out to employees saying, we have a ransomware attack, our systems are down. Don't worry, they only got some of your information, but it's fine, we're looking into it. And then all of a sudden, maybe a client calls in and the employee says something of that. We all have these relationships, we kind of talk offhand, don't really think, but then it spreads. Something like this will spread like wildfire. So it's what Neel is saying. We need to have that plan in place, the plan to escalate data breaches to the right parties, the plan to how we're going to handle communications. Right? We want to make sure our message is uniform, the narrative is tight, and that we stay on script. And I mean, it sounds cheesy, but if you really think about it, if you've got 10 people giving different messages, then all of a sudden the people they talk to are going to give different messages. It's a game of telephone. If I tell Neel something and Neel tells Natalie something, the same story, Natalie tells someone else, same story, so on and so forth. The second it gets back to me, it's going to be a completely different story. And the reputational harm from that is fairly catastrophic. So it's staying ahead of the comms aspect. And then finally, it's neglecting how much this is going to cost. People just don't get how much a data breach costs and everything that's involved, from the legal, forensics, if you need PR, even if you don't need PR, notification services. Imagine having, 15 gigabytes of data that you need to figure out what information is in there and who is impacted. You got to bring an e-discovery firm in, because you're not going to sit there. You don't want to dedicate the time resources from your own company to sit there and go through every single document and look for that. So you got to hire someone to do that. And those costs become exorbitant. Notification, how much does it cost to send these letters out? Offer credit monitoring. So the costs just build and build and build. And that's why you need the right insurance policy, because if you don't have it, it's going to come right out of your pocket.
Great, thank you. So after a data breach has occurred, after the dust has settled, the chaos is over, what steps do organizations need to take in order to recover and address remediation?
Neel, you want to kick that off? Oh, I think you're on mute, Neel.
I was saying, I'll let you start that one off.
Oh, okay. I think the big thing is that it's almost a debrief. And we look at it as you got to review, revise, and restart. We want to go back to the first part. We want to discuss what policies you had in place. Did you have an incident response plan there? If you don't, we really want to get you one, because once again, you're going to save on average about 40% of the increased cost from a data breach. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. We want to make sure that you've got the written information security policy. We want to make sure all of these policies are conforming to the state laws, potential federal obligations, federal regulatory obligations, international. We want to figure out where your holes are. That's very much a technical side. So how did they get in? How can we fix this? And what's a cost-effective way to do it? You can spend millions and millions of dollars on this, on technical and cybersecurity, but maybe you don't need that. Maybe it's not industry standard. We just want to be able to demonstrate reasonableness. Because if a hacker wants to get into your systems, they'll get in at some point. But if you can demonstrate you took reasonable steps to try to prevent it, if you had these policies, protocols, procedures in place, if you prepared, if you had the right technical resources, then you can talk to your clients and employees in the government afterwards and say, look, we did these things. We tried to stop this. But on the other side of it, if you do nothing, it's not going to be reasonable. If you aren't doing those cost-effective mechanisms to try to prevent it, it's not going to be reasonable. It's not going to be an acceptable answer to your clients, employees, and the government. Finally, it's about vetting. Even if this did not involve your external vendors, recognizing the vulnerability from the vendor that comes from vendors is really important, because once again, even if it didn't start with the vendor this time, it could start next time. And what we know is about 50% of data breaches start with vendors, and the costs increase by about $370,000 on average for a data breach. So it's really starting a deep dive and prioritizing what vendors you want to put resources to, what vendors are going to cause the most problems if there was a breach.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, I mean, I think once the dust settles and there has been some level of resolution to the event that occurred, what I always want our insureds to be aware of is that, whether it's utilizing one of our vendors that may have been involved in the forensics aspect of the response, or another vendor that maybe might be able to come in and educate them on what improvements to their systems may be feasible based on what occurred. It's always important to consider at the conclusion of the type of event what may or may not help prevent these types of attacks in the future, whether it's something as simple as multi-factor authentication, or do they want to implement endpoint monitoring for, some period of time. I think one of the things that our insureds are always not aware of when they, file a claim and we're involved in the response is that betterments to systems and improvements to servers or endpoints or whatever it may be within the company are not generally covered under the insurance policy. So there may be some policies there where there is a betterment sublimit, where there might be a small amount of money available to pay for improvements to the insured systems and to the insured's overall cybersecurity operation. However, generally that's not something that's covered, and I think that takes some insureds by surprise, and it's something that they're not fully aware of when they are reporting a claim. They think, oh, now we can just do all these things to our systems and make improvements and buy new equipment if needed, and the insurance company is just going to pay for it. That's not generally the case. And so what I always let our insureds know at the outset is that once we do figure out what happened here, how did the threat actors get in, were there specific vulnerabilities identified that led to the event in question, that they are kind of aware from the outset and not just at the end of this whole process, that if there are considerations they want to put in place as far as whether it's new equipment or improvements to the system, that they're thinking about that from the outset, and they're thinking about how and when they want to try to implement that, because they need to consider the cost and the likelihood is that the insurance company is not going to cover it, given that it will be putting their overall operation in a better state than it was when the attack occurred, and that's just not something generally covered. So, we always want them thinking about talking to people like Spencer and our other vendors about what exactly occurred, so they not only have an understanding of how it happened, but also what improvements and additions can they make to ensure that it does not happen again. But that's something that we like to talk to them about at the beginning, so that they're not caught off guard at the end of the process when we have to let them know that a lot of what they may be seeking to do is likely not a covered item under the cyber insurance policy.
And I got to piggyback on Neel on that, because I think what you said is really important. And that's one thing I tell all my clients, where I'm like, do you understand what's in your policy? You need to go get with Neel and his team, or the team at Hiscox that you work with, because you really do want to understand. You really want to understand what is being covered and what's not being covered, because you don't want to get ambushed. And I think that's a key part that brokers, agents, and underwriters can play in helping to educate, their insureds. I love pairing with brokers, agents, and even underwriters to help my clients really get it, because if they get it, when it happens, it makes my life easier, because I get angry calls saying, why is this not covered? What's happening? And then obviously it's a delicate balance at that point. But to cover that at the front end, as Neel's saying, to have that understanding, it really makes life a lot easier.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why the initial contact with the carrier is so important, because as soon as that happens, there is an immediate plan put in place, through a firm like Spencer's, along with the synchronicity with the carrier, to ensure that we're using the panel vendors. The panel vendors, for the most part, understand our coverages, what is and is not covered, and therefore, our insureds can, pretty generally rely on the fact that if we have engaged our panel vendors, it is very unlikely that they're going to be engaging in large amounts of work that are not covered by the policy and are going to be leaving them stuck with a hefty bill for something that maybe they did not initially anticipate. We always see the exact opposite play out when the insurer does not contact us first and they are involving off-panel vendors, because those off-panel vendors will take it as a blank check to run with it and do whatever they may deem reasonable and hope that the insurance company is going to pay for it anyways, and that is usually not the case. We're always seeing them doing large amounts of work that are not covered, and that just makes it a messy situation. It leads to disagreement with the insured becomes frustrated with the carrier, and it just leads to a lot less successful resolution of a claim when we're not involving the panel vendors from the outset. So like Spencer said, it's really hugely critical to not only understand the coverage, but also to also have a good sense of how it will play out in real life in practice when there is an actual event that occurs that results in a claim being filed under the policy.
Great, thank you. Looking to the future, what kind of trends or threats or opportunities do you see coming up in the cybersecurity space for organizations or for cyber insurers?
I think on the carrier side, I think what there's going to be more and more focus on as we move forward is prevention and mitigation and offering, pre-breach, pre-claim services to our insureds that maybe have not been generally part of the cyber insurance process over the last, many years. I think, we want to have more focus on ensuring that our insureds are not only presented with options on that pre-claim, pre-breach type front, so they can, like I said before, if they want to do tabletop exercises, or they want someone to come in and take a look at their systems, that we're offering those options to them at the outset and giving them that option. It may not necessarily be covered under the policy, obviously, because there's no claim, but we can ensure that they're getting access to our vendors, access to our negotiated insurance panel rates, and can have a kind of a wide array of options being provided to them at the outset on a prevention mitigation level, so that they can maybe eat a little bit of a cost, but prevent larger claims down the road or larger events which may result in third-party claims. And I have several insureds right now where we have multiple class actions pending, and it's quite evident that there is a very high likelihood that their limit may be exceeded in attempting to resolve these class actions. And so, when we see those kinds of things, it just further heightens our level of wanting to ensure that our insureds are prepared and have access to those mitigation options before they suffer such a large event. And so I think there's going to be more and more of a trend on the insurance carrier side as we move forward in providing multiple options and hoping that will help mitigate some of the vast magnitude of claims that we see. As Spencer indicated before, there's a very, very high average cost of a breach, and the more that can be done before a claim actually hits our doorstep, the better it'll be, and the more likely we'll be able to cut costs, not only for us, but for our insureds.
Yeah, I agree with Neel. I think you're going to see a bigger push by insurers. Obviously, Neel is very much knows more about this side than me, but push from insurers to get that pre-breach mitigation services, working with, paying for tech or legal to help an insured access those services. I always encourage my client to see if those services are available for their carrier and to do them. I feel like a lot of them are like, yeah, well, I'll do it. And they just never do it. And I'm like, this is free. Well, come on, like, what's the problem here? So helping educate them though about the importance of it. I think moving forward too, we're going to see continued massive ransomware attacks and kind of expansion on them. You look at a ransomware group called Clop, which is the silliest name I think I've ever heard from one of these groups. But what they do is like a triple attack where they'll come in, they encrypt your system so you can't use them. All the while, they'll take your information and threaten to sell it on the dark web. And then they'll do a massive email campaign to all the emails they got. It's called spray and pay. So these threat actors, these ransomware groups, they're getting better. They keep getting better. And we're always kind of on the response. We're always trying to react to them. But the more kind of we have that front end preparation is what I say is almost taking the fight to them. I truly believe it is a war that we're in against these actors. And the only way we're going to get ahead of it is to be prepared, is to kind of be ready, have the proper protocols, safeguards in place, the insurance, the legal. So yeah, I can definitely see this continuing and just getting worse, unfortunately.
Thank you. So we are planning to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So a reminder to attendees, please send those in. But before we get to those, I guess the last question from me, from each of your perspectives, what would be the most important piece of information or advice you'd like attendees to take away from this session? Spencer, why don't you start?
Okay, I'll jump in first. If a breach happens, call me. I'm just kidding. I wish I could see everyone's reactions to see if that joke worked or not, but I'll just assume everybody's getting a good laugh. But in all seriousness, we need to be proactive. We need to stop being reactive. We need to recognize that this is an existential threat. We need to encourage our clients and the insureds that they need to be proactive and spend the resources up front so then you don't have the catastrophic harms when it occurs.
I think for me, it would be, I tell all of our insureds when this type of event happens, this is the exact reason why you purchase this policy. And I think the one takeaway I would want everyone here that either interacts or deals with insureds or brokers or carriers on a daily or weekly basis is that do everything you can possibly to educate insureds on what this coverage entails, what is included in the policy. A lot of insureds aren't even aware they have sublimits for things like cybercrime deception, where if they are, they get a spoofed email and they are sucked into a wire fraud scheme, that they have, a separate limit in their policy for that type of event. A lot of insureds aren't aware that they can offer, credit monitoring reasonably under the policy and have it paid for by the carrier if they have, employees of the company affected in the breach, or clients or other people with sensitive data that may have been impacted. So it's very, very crucially important, I think, for insureds to continue to be aware of what's in their policy. A lot of times they're purchasing these policies with very little education at all on how it would actually apply in a real life situation. And so I think the more that all of us as a team can do, whether it's, Spencer as counsel, myself as the carrier, or broker partners, to make them aware of generally what is and is not included in the insurance coverage or in the policy generally, will help immensely when insureds do have an event which requires them to involve the carrier and involve their policy, which is implicated under the event. So I think just understanding that coverage, knowing how it will apply, and knowing exactly where and how to communicate to the carrier when an event hits.
Okay, thank you both very much. So now we do have time for Q&A. I haven't seen any questions come in, so please send them in, but I can filibuster. So do you guys have any kind of interesting stories or examples, without naming any companies, of anything particularly disastrous that's happened, or anything that's gone really well, that's a real success story? Anything interesting?
I guess I'm trying to think how I got to be able to couch this very carefully. A disaster story would be a ransomware attack where the client insured had sublimits of, I think, 5,000 for legal, IT, and ransom payments, and they didn't believe that. Obviously I couldn't get involved. And to say that became pretty catastrophic for them is an understatement, because their systems were locked out and a lot of their information was taken. So they got hit pretty bad financially, obviously. I'd say a success story is on the exact opposite end, where I talked to a client where their limits were very bad to start, and I encouraged them to go talk to their broker, and they did. They got their limits raised. They didn't start the front end work though, and unfortunately, like 3 months later, they got hit. But they had the policy in place that was able to protect them. Yeah, I mean, but it all really revolves around ransomware to me. It's about understanding there's so many costs to ransomware, and if your clients and your insureds and the insureds don't understand that, it's a big issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen a couple of instances in the last few months where we had insureds who were hit by a ransomware event, maybe with very low ransom demand and viable backups, so they were able to restore from backups, and they had their IT guys as the ones involved with the process, and the IT people internally concluded that there was no, data compromise or evidence of a data breach, and then they just kind of left it. They never reported it to us, and then I think Spencer maybe even brought this up before, but then about a month later, they were hit with an even more extensive ransomware attack. Finally reported it to us. We had forensics come in. Forensics essentially concluded that there likely was data compromise from the first event as well. And when those types of things happen, it just places not only the insured, but the carrier counsel in just a much more precarious and urgent position, because now there are, people that you likely have to notify from the first event, as well as now the second event, which is a even higher demand, and everything is locked up, and we're just seeing that it's significantly higher costs resulting because these insureds are relying on their internal IT people to make these conclusions. And what I always tell our insureds is, no matter what the scale of event that may have occurred is, we always want to ensure that whether or not we conclude that there was data compromise or not, that we have a firm that is able to draft a breach risk assessment for you at the conclusion of an event, so that you have that in case there are any, third-party claims down the road, or any regulatory involvement that may, ask to see something like that. So I try to make it a matter of practice for us to ensure that those types of things are being done. In fact, I don't know if you want to talk about what a breach risk assessment is and how you guys generally handle that.
I mean, for us, when a breach assessment occurs after the breach, is really just going through with a tech firm as well. I look at all the legal side, the compliance aspects, talking about basically all the remediation. I hate things in writing. No, that's what I would say. But that's the lawyer in me. The tech side really is going to give you that overview of what wrong, what you can fix. I'm very particular, though, about what goes in writing once again, because while everything is cloaked by attorney work product, you never know what crazy judge you might get who might overrule you, and then issues come. But it's definitely about plugging what we've learned in, because you don't want to make the same mistakes again.
We've actually had a few audience questions come in now. So the first one, in the next few years, what do you think, if any, the increased usage of AI or machine learning to assist both hackers and organizations, such as automated attack or discovery using pre-trained systems, or increased social engineering with more believable AIs?
I think it's going to be a huge problem, and it's not going to be helpful for us. I think the problem that we've seen throughout the history of cyber is that the attackers are always more advanced than us. If you look at what happened with SolarWinds, the government uses what's called Einstein, with their government infrastructure. Einstein was there to detect what threats and vulnerabilities were known, but not what was not known. So that's how they got in, right? It kind of makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. So the problem is we're just reactive. So the farther down the road and the more advanced AI gets, I can promise you they're going to be ahead of us in terms of that. And so it's going to be a lot of reactive responses. The responses will probably be quicker, though, in terms of identifying and responding. I don't see a way that we'll be able to fully prevent these kinds of attacks, though.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. We haven't really seen that in practice just yet, but I mean, it's a great question. I think as technology continues to just exceed what we have now, that's going to be a definite major issue, and how we address that, I think, remains to be seen. I think that's another area where there's going to need to be as much free service and mitigation services applied as possible to educate insurers on how that may work and how that might come across as far as what a social engineering incident resulting from something AI-driven would look like.
Yeah, and social engineering is such a devious and sophisticated way of doing things, but also almost easy because of how much information's out there about us. And so, to the question, the more AI you have with this and the better engineered it is, it's already easy to socially engineer somebody, to socially engineer me, unfortunately, and then send an email from an account that looks like mine. But then if you imagine an AI coming in and maybe somehow figuring out how I put things in an email, my syntax, the language I use, and then being able to incorporate that. I mean, there's very scary possibilities with it.
Okay, our next question is, do you see any developments from regulators on applying pressure on companies to improve controls related to potential cybersecurity?
Neil, you want to jump in first, or we jump in?
I'll give you that one. That's your purview.
Well, I've been jumping in first, so I felt bad.
You're good.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think you're definitely going to see this moving forward with more regulators getting involved, because the whole point of cyber laws, or laws in general, is regulators and the government identify a threat that's causing harm. So the next part of that is, how can they fix the harm? How can they protect people? They enact laws. The laws are there then, unfortunately, to deter and punish. And one thing we've seen from regulators is, if you don't respond, one, in terms of prevention, the companies that aren't doing anything are the ones that are going to get hit the hardest. The ones that have done things and have reasonable standards in place, reasonable procedures, have done vetting and can show that. Some laws have safe harbors. Well, they'll protect you. Not all laws. But then it turns to the ones that don't have those safe harbors and the companies that don't do anything. Regulators are going to start getting worse and worse. I don't want to say worse. They're going to start getting more intensive in terms of their enforcement, because they are going to continue to see these threats and the harm that's it's causing. And if companies aren't doing the easy steps, they're not going to take kindly to that. So in terms of, let's just take it, for example, the insurance data model security laws that are popping up across the country. South Carolina was one of the first ones to do it. And they have pretty strict requirements and pretty heavy fines and penalties. I talked to the deputy director of the insurance commissioner office, I think that's their title, last year about this. And I asked, because they have a low threshold for an insurance company, broker, agent for the law to apply. And I asked, are you really going after like these small to mid-sized broker agents, even insurance carriers? And what they said is, we're not hunting for people in trouble, but we're not going to ignore it anymore. We're going to enforce these laws because, one, we're the first state to do it, and two, they see a huge problem. So the short answer for my long-winded speech is, yeah, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more regulatory action.
Yeah, and I would agree, just based on some of what we've seen as far as regulatory involvement in different claims of ours. Right now, it looks to be more targeted, specifically when they're investigating, certain insured that may have had a very extensive breach of sensitive data. But I think, as Spencer said, that's going to become more of a trend as far as general regulations go as we move forward. And I think that's something that's definitely going to be coming down the pike over the next couple of years. Maybe we haven't seen it as extensively recently. And like I said, I think the majority of what we do see right now is generally specifically devoted to certain insureds in response to the type of breach they suffered. But as more of these extensive breaches occur, I think there's going to be much more extensive regulatory involvement and new implementations.
We've had a couple of questions come in about changes in the COVID environment, more people working from home, and changes you've seen there, and if companies are changing how they respond to dealing with and educating their employees.
We definitely saw an uptick in claims during the first few months of the pandemic, when there was a lot more transition to the work from home environment. But that has not been as pronounced over the last, I would say, 6 to 8 months or so. I think once everyone got used to the new normal, once companies realized that this was not just going to be a 2 or 3 month window where everyone would be working from home, there was a lot more education provided. I mean, I know even here at Hiscox, we see emails from our IT security staff all the time about, do's and don'ts and what types of trends they're seeing as far as, social engineering incidents or malicious emails. And so we definitely saw that uptick initially, but I think as companies have realized that this may be the new normal for quite some time, for another couple of years, where the majority of the work staff is not going to be primarily office-based, there's been a lot more devotion to ensuring that proper education provided, that new protocols are put in place, and that has significantly reduced the number of claims that we were seeing during that first period of the pandemic.
We now have a quite specific question. Do you have any recommendations on antivirus software to use, especially while working remotely?
So that goes, I try to always stay in my lane with technical versus legal. I mean, it depends. If we're talking about like an individual versus a corporate, if you're a corporate, I think you need, or commercial, you need an endpoint detection service. Carbon Black, Arctic Wolf, Sentinel-1, they're not cheap, but they're really good. If we're talking individual, I never really think about the individual side just because I'm always dealing with the commercial side. I don't know, Neil, do you have any thoughts about the individual side? Well, I mean, are we asking about the corporate side or individual side? I guess that's a better question.
You didn't specify, but I'm assuming corporate because it relates to.
Yeah, I mean, if it's the corporate, I mean, I would say exactly what you said, Spencer. I mean, we always recommend Sentinel-1 or Carbon Black. I mean, I think that's very helpful as a preventative measure. Yeah, from an individual perspective, I mean, I've seen some of our companies, or some of our smaller insured companies, utilizing Norton, but that is literally just something that I think they've incorporated or maybe had recommended to them as a result of a smaller claim. But as far as individual mitigation, I'm with you. I'm not as technically proficient on antivirus software. But from the corporate standpoint, you definitely would want to incorporate one of those endpoint monitoring services, which, as Spencer said, might, if there was a claim under the policy, be covered for some period of time, but we always recommend keeping it in place even after the claim concludes, as long as it's kind of financially feasible for our insureds. Those are very, very effective at not only determining whether there's any threat actor movement through the systems, but also just as a preventative measure that our corporate insureds implement.
Are there any ethical concerns in the cyber insurance space as it evolves?
I mean, ethically, I think the concern that always is present is whether or not we're paying, foreign state or nation state threat actors. Obviously, we always want an OFAC check when we're paying a ransom to a threat acting group, but we're seeing more and more threat actors requesting payment in Monero as opposed to Bitcoin, and Monero is substantially less traceable and therefore posing some very significant concerns on the insurance carrier end as to whether or not paying Monero is actually appropriate or not. Spencer, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, I know nobody has a problem making payment in Bitcoin, but with the rise in Monero demands, which they're also kind of doing at a reduced price. So if, I've had claims recently where we received a demand in Monero and then a demand in Bitcoin. The Monero demand was almost $100,000 less, but we ended up going the Bitcoin route just because there still isn't enough education and knowledge out there on the viability of making a Monero payment, and its lack of traceability is just causing, I think, some ethical concerns on our end as far as whether we might be running awry at OFAC if we were to do that. Spencer, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, Neil definitely hit it on the head, the point on the head there. In terms of like OFAC, so we're talking about the Office of, it's the Treasury Department. They came out with an advisory in November basically saying, we know you're paying ransomware. A, stop paying ransomware, but B, if you pay, you better make sure you're not paying anyone on their blacklist. These are basically any corporations, individuals, entities that they've sanctioned and said you cannot do business with. And the fear, I agree with Neil, my biggest concern immediately with ransomware payments is we need to make sure that we're not paying a state-sponsored actor, a terrorist group, or someone on this list, beyond the moral concerns. The liability concerns is that the Treasury Department will come back and basically say, okay, you paid. Here's your civil liability, which is millions upon millions upon millions of dollars, plus you could have criminal liability. So that's a huge concern. Second, in terms of the Monero, Neil's right. In terms of tracing it, that scares me. I mean, it always scares me, but Bitcoin is a bit easier. The other cryptos are not. And once again, these threat actors are smart and they don't want to be traced. So yeah, I mean, those are kind of the ethical concerns I get concerned about.
Okay, thank you very much. And we are just about at the hour, so I'd like to thank you both for your expertise and your time. I'd like to thank all of the attendees for your time and interest in this topic. Thank you all for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Natalie.